The King George V class of battleship is an interesting one, and not just because it's the second class of British battleship to bear that name. 3 out of 5 of the class had moments of excitement, incredibly famous excitement at that. King George V and Prince of Wales both fought Bismarck during that ship's attempt to break into the Atlantic. Prince of Wales would then, alongside HMS Repulse, demonstrate the rise of aviation over the big gun. Duke of York, meanwhile, fought Scharnhorst in the cold north in a battle that has gone down in history. That leaves 2 ships, Howe and Anson. This video will focus on the latter ship, as she often gets overlooked, through no fault of the ship or her crew, mind you, simply because the Royal Navy used her in quieter areas of operation. The end result would see Anson miss any real action, which has left her overlooked in the modern day. Let's change that, if only a little, with this video. To begin, the ship that became HMS Anson was laid down on July 20th, 1937, under the original name of HMS Jellicoe, before someone along the chain pointed out how recent Jellicoe was for a namesake. The name was, at that point, changed to Anson after Admiral George Anson, an admiral from the 1700s. While technically the 4th of the class ordered, Anson was actually the last to be laid down. HMS Howe, the technical last ship in the class, was laid down on June 1st of 1937. That said, Anson's construction would progress at more or less the same pace as her sister ships, at least at first. The battleship was launched on February 24th, 1940. This was 4 days before HMS Duke of York on February 28th. And quite a bit ahead of Howe on April 9th. Things did slow down at this point, however. Anson would take a little over 2 years to fit out. This slowdown in construction was a result of shifting priorities, material shortages, and modifications to the design. Not of the big and sweeping nature, but more along the lines of better fire control radar and more anti-aircraft weaponry. These complications would all come together and delay Anson's completion until April of 1942. Specifically, the battleship commissioned on April 14, 1942. During that construction period, HMS Centurion, the last of the previous King George V class, was disguised as Anson, an elaborate decoy move that I covered in a previous video. Suffice to say, from a distance, it actually worked quite well, especially from the air. It's also amusing that you have a King George masquerading as another King George. But that aside, let's do a Cliff Notes technical description before we move on. HMS Anson displaced 42,600 tons on her sea trials. Her service displacement went up a fair bit from there, with the deep load climbing as high as 45,000 tons. On that displacement, the battleship carried 10 14-inch, 356mm guns, in the distinctive layout of this class, with 2 quadruple turrets and 1 twin. A quad on the bow, with the twin superfiring over it, and the second quad on the stern. Those turrets could be fairly finicky in actual use, although by the time Anson entered service, the worst of the issues had been ironed out. To support those weapons, Anson also carried 16 5.25-inch guns. These were carried in 8 twin mounts, all amidships, with 4 on either side of the ship. These were dual-purpose weapons, intended for both surface and anti-aircraft usage. The dedicated anti-aircraft weaponry, meanwhile, varied quite a bit over the course of her career. It would generally consist of 40mm pom-pom guns in octuple mounting, as well as 40mm Bofors in twin or quad mounts, and finally 20mm cannon to round things off. The exact number of these weapons, as well as the combination of them, does vary on when you're looking at the ship. By 1945, Burt notes that Anson had 96 40mm pom-poms, between 10 octuple mounts and 4 quads, as an example. As designed, Anson also carried 2 seaplanes with a catapult and hangar mounted amidships. This was, however, removed in 1944. All of this equipment was protected by a main belt of 14.7 inches or 370 millimeters, one of the thickest of any battleship in raw thickness. This was, in turn, supported by a deck of 5 to 6 inches in thickness. And while carrying that, the ship could reach between 27 to 30 knots, depending on loading and quality of fuel. The designed maximum speed was 28 knots, with 28 to 29 being the typical maximum. With that covered, back to service history, which was, as I alluded to earlier, pretty quiet. It began in traditional fashion. After her commissioning, Anson sailed to Scapa Flow to join the home fleet and finish working up. This process would run from July through September of 1942, at which point Anson began her most common duty, escorting Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union. This would largely be a distant escort sort of thing, with Anson watching for any moves by the German surface fleet. As a result, she wouldn't be engaged by the Germans and wouldn't engage them in turn. The only exceptions to this general rule, from September 1942 through June of 1943, came in patrols in other cold areas, namely 2 trips to patrol around Iceland, the first running from October through November 1942, and the second from March to May of 1943. In both cases, nothing really happened. Anson wouldn't find any German commerce raiders and would return to Scapa Flow before moving back to the general Norwegian area. All of this was good and important duty, don't get me wrong. I don't want to sound like I'm downplaying it, especially because if Tirpitz had sortied, Anson would have been the line blocking her from the convoys. However, there's very little to talk about with these actions, at least directly involving HMS Anson, although more excitement would eventually come, even if it remained secondary roles that saw no actual combat. For example, in July of 1943, Anson participated in diversionary actions toward Norway. This was intended to keep German attention in the north and away from Sicily, where Operation Husky was soon to launch. It was meant to keep them guessing and provide an element of surprise. How well it worked is up for debate, of course, but Anson would spend much of July on these missions, even after Husky actually launched. But because she wasn't directly involved in the invasion, the battleship continued to miss the chance to actually fight. She would actually miss another chance soon after in September. On September 8th, Anson set sail to intercept Tirpitz and Scharnhorst after they bombarded Spitsbergen. However, the Germans slipped away, and Anson returned to Scapa Flow empty-handed, only to return to Norwegian waters in October, this time to cover USS Ranger as she attacked German shipping, that being Operation Leader. While this was largely successful on Ranger's part, Anson once more had very little to do. For the rest of 1943 and into early 1944, it was back to providing distant cover for Arctic convoys. Nothing major of note happened in these months, at least for Anson. Duke of York would, in late December 1943, fight the Battle of the North Cape. Anson got no such chance. Her next deviation from convoy escorts came instead in February of 1944. On February 24th, Anson joined the French battleship Richelieu in covering HMS Furious for more air attacks on the Norwegian coast. Much as with Ranger, Anson provided valuable cover, but there were no actual attacks to break up. This would hold true in April of 1944 as well, when Anson and Furious returned to Norwegian waters. The first raid came on April 3rd, when Furious launched Barracuda bombers against Tirpitz. This was the most successful of the raids Furious launched, doing a fair amount of damage to the German battleship. Bad weather would prevent any further attacks in April, with the remainder of Anson and Furious's time off Norway spent on German merchant shipping. More raids in May were called off due to bad weather, and Anson would be withdrawn from service for a refit in June of 1944. It wasn't a typical overhaul in this case, but a massive refit for Pacific service. As Anson had spent all of her career to this point in Arctic conditions, well, a lot of cold weather equipment had to be removed, and replaced with tropical equipment, in addition to a long overdue overhaul. Because of this, Anson was in refit from June 1944 through to March 1945. In addition to the tropical equipment and general fixing up, Anson had several changes made. Her radars were replaced by newer models, and the same went for the fire control systems. Her close-range anti-aircraft defenses were also enhanced in light of the kamikaze threat. The biggest single change, however, was removing her aviation facilities to increase accommodation space and give more space for boats. In fairness, with radar coming into its own, the seaplanes weren't as necessary by that point. Regardless, Anson only rejoined the fleet in March of 1945, and her post-refit trials lasted until the end of April on top of that. Because of this, Anson didn't sail for the Pacific until May, and she wouldn't arrive in Sydney, Australia until July. By that point, the war was largely over. Within a month of her arrival in Australia, the Japanese had surrendered. With that, Anson missed her last chance to fight directly. It's been said, as a result, that Anson never fired her main guns in anger. Near as I can tell from reading her service history, she might have never used her anti-aircraft battery either. It is worth noting, though, that I don't have access to British archives. Sources like Burt make no mention of any proper combat, but without the logbooks from Anson, I can't say for sure that she never used her weaponry. In any case, with the war over, Anson spent the rest of her career on quiet duties. She accepted the Japanese surrender in Hong Kong on September 16, 1945. She remained in Hong Kong until December, as both a base ship and the flagship of the 1st Battle Squadron of the British Pacific Fleet. After a short refit in Australia, from January to February of 1946, Anson spent a couple months in both Japan and Hong Kong, before ultimately returning to Britain by the end of July 1946, at which point Anson went into refit until October. During that process, she relieved HMS Nelson as the flagship of the Home Fleet Training Squadron. Anson remained in that role from 1947 through to 1949. She lasted just long enough for one of the first NATO exercises in summer of 1949, after which the battleship went in for a final refit in November. This lasted until August 1950 and was done to prepare her for reserve. And at the conclusion of the refit, that's exactly where Anson went. She was placed in reserve and would never leave. The battleship lasted until the end of 1957. On December 17th of that year, HMS Anson was sold for scrapping. She may not have had the most exciting of careers, but the duty Anson served was important nonetheless. If the Germans had actually tried to sortie against the convoys she guarded, Anson would have been there to contest it. That's a valuable role in of itself, and one definitely worth remembering. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.